The door clicked shut behind me, and I felt the sudden chill of silence press against the walls of the house I had lived in for decades. A casual voice broke through, flat and deliberate. "We're moving into your room." My stomach tightened before my mind could form a clear response, and my eyes swept toward the doorway, searching for any hint of a joke. The room itself looked the same it always had. Faded wallpaper, a small oak dresser with worn edges, and a window that tilted open unevenly. But the lock on the door glinted strangely, a brass anomaly I hadn't noticed before. A folded towel on the dresser was out of place, its corner tucked awkwardly under the lamp, as if shifted with intent. I forced a calm, measured breath, trying to dismiss the line as idle chatter. Perhaps she meant she would redecorate or just temporarily use the space. Yet the way she leaned against the wall, her smile easy and confident, carried an unfamiliar certainty that unsettled me. I caught the faint scent of her perfume, floral but sharp, hanging in the air longer than expected, and my mind flicked to the past, small incidents I had never questioned, minor manipulations that now felt like warnings in hindsight. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I moved closer, examining the door with an analytical eye. The lock itself was different from the simple mechanism I had installed. It seemed newer, deliberate. My hand hovered near the knob, tension running through my fingers, but I didn't reach for it. Objects on the dresser, the folded towel, a stack of papers, appeared slightly displaced. I cataloged each discrepancy, instinctually noting the subtle changes without letting them provoke overt alarm. She laughed softly at something in the kitchen, entirely unbothered by the rising unease in my chest. The casualness of her tone contrasted sharply with the undercurrent of threat I now sensed, and it forced me to question my own assumptions. How could a single statement, so seemingly ordinary, tilt the atmosphere of a room so completely? My eyes scanned the walls, the corners, the small trinkets I had arranged over years, and I realized they looked different somehow. Not because they had changed, but because I was seeing them through the lens of suspicion for the first time. I reminded myself that perhaps I was overreacting, that the line was just misplaced humor, that I had allowed my mind to wander into unnecessary tension. But as I noted the unusual lock, the subtle displacement of objects, and her unwavering smile, a cold awareness settled that something in the house was not as it should be, and I was not as in control as I believed. The air felt heavier, the quiet punctuated by small, intentional noises, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint scrape of a chair in another room. Each sound sharpened by my alertness, and in that clarity I understood this was no casual remark. It was a challenge, and the room I thought I knew so well might no longer be mine. The house was quieter than it had been in years, the kind of silence that presses against the ribs and makes ordinary creaks feel deliberate. Since my wife passed, I had grown accustomed to my own company, the rhythm of a solitary life measured in small routines, morning coffee on the porch, the papers sorted precisely, the garden pruned with exacting care. Loneliness had a shape, and I knew its edges. It had been predictable, safe even. But now, with her voice echoing in my hallway, that comfort felt fragile. I thought about my son, always polite, always trying to keep the household running smoothly, and the way he had spoken about his wife when they first moved in. She had seemed considerate, organized, attentive to detail, someone who could manage the home without making waves. Yet beneath that surface, I remembered small moments that had caught my attention. Stories she told about errands or purchases sometimes didn't line up, minor contradictions brushed off with a quick smile or shrug. At the time, I had rationalized them, assuming distraction or fatigue. Financial oddities had appeared sporadically, bills slightly higher than expected, receipts that didn't match my own records, small withdrawals I hadn't made myself. Each instance was minor, easily overlooked. And I told myself it was nothing, that mistakes happened, that I was imagining patterns where none existed. Still, the thought lingered at the edges of my mind. What if I hadn't been paying attention? What if I had let small things slide that now mattered? Could I be overreacting? The question circled silently as I looked toward the door she had declared hers. Her earlier comment, once dismissible, now felt like a thread tugging at a larger, unseen web. I tried to find a rational explanation. Perhaps she meant it as a joke, perhaps it was a temporary arrangement, but the precision in her voice and the casual certainty of her tone resisted those interpretations. Something about the room itself unsettled me. The corners seemed sharper, the shadows deeper, and the lock I had barely registered yesterday now felt like a deliberate barrier. My eyes lingered on the dresser again, noting how items were shifted, as though someone had been practicing control over this space for weeks. I had always trusted the familiar, but that trust now felt premature, almost naive. A quiet suspicion settled in, one that I could neither name nor dismiss. It wasn't fear yet, not entirely, but a realization that this house, my home, contained secrets I had not accounted for. I knew enough to sense that what I had once considered ordinary was now tinged with intention, and that intention was not mine. The unease clung to the edges of the room, subtle and persistent, demanding vigilance where I had once allowed comfort. Her footsteps were lighter than I remembered, almost imperceptible, yet deliberate in their placement. She moved through the hall with an ease that suggested familiarity beyond what I had allowed, pausing briefly by corners as if scanning for something unseen. I noticed the kitchen towels folded differently than the night before. The spice jars shifted ever so slightly, the keys left on the counter in an arrangement I didn't recognize. Nothing large enough to alarm at first, but precise enough to unsettle the rhythm I had cultivated. When she answered a question about groceries, her explanation contradicted the list I had carefully prepared just days ago. Small details, extra items I hadn't ordered, a justification for quantities that didn't match household consumption. Felt rehearsed, casual, yet deliberate. My mind cataloged these discrepancies, mentally marking them as anomalies, trying to convince myself it was coincidence. Still, a seed of doubt had taken root. The locked door at the far end of the hall drew my attention. She skirted past it with a subtle shift in posture, her hand brushing the frame without acknowledgement. I asked, lightly, about it, and she offered a vague excuse, too quick and too practiced. My pulse spiked, a cold jolt of apprehension running through me, but I tried to reason it away. Perhaps it was a storage closet, perhaps something mundane I had overlooked. Rational explanations refused to settle the tension in my chest. The house itself seemed alive in subtle ways. Floorboards creaked under weightless footsteps in rooms that should have been empty. A faint whisper of movement echoed from behind a closed door, the kind of sound that is easily dismissed yet impossible to ignore. I found myself listening more closely, every scrape and murmur cataloged, analyzed, and compared against my knowledge of the home. Objects that I had arranged meticulously appeared shifted, papers slightly askew on the desk, a teacup nudged from its usual spot, a jacket draped over a chair differently. Each alteration was minor, but in sequence they formed a pattern that demanded attention. I began to track them silently, forming mental notes, making small calculations about timing and intent. I forced myself to breathe steadily, to note the differences without panic, but the tension coiled tighter with every observation. The room felt less familiar, the once predictable space now shadowed with quiet anomalies. I realized that every movement she made, every explanation she offered, was being filtered through a lens of calculation. My awareness sharpened, my patience with uncertainty was becoming a weapon. I began watching her movements more deliberately, noting the paths she took through the house and the areas she carefully avoided. The hallway at the far end, the study tucked behind the main living room, even the small storage closet near the kitchen. She passed them with a measured glance but never lingered. Each avoidance seemed purposeful, a silent assertion that certain spaces were off limits or contained something she did not want disturbed. I cross-checked her explanations against what I knew of the household. Bills, schedules, inventory of supplies. Small inconsistencies stood out, repeated patterns that refused to align with simple forgetfulness. She spoke of errands and purchases that I had no record of, cited interactions with vendors that seemed unverifiable, and justified shifts in the home's order with reasons that strained credulity. My mind began cataloging these anomalies, layering each observation atop the last, slowly forming a picture of intentional behavior. A stack of receipts on the counter caught my attention. They were recent, oddly precise, and bore unfamiliar names of stores and services. A quick glance at my emails revealed confirmations I had not authorized, deliveries supposedly addressed to me, but clearly orchestrated by someone else. It was small, bureaucratic evidence, almost mundane in isolation, but taken together it hinted at deliberate manipulation. I asked questions quietly of the housekeeper, in tones casual enough to avoid suspicion. The answers were careful, polite, but the unease behind them confirmed my intuition. Not everything was as it should be. Even neighbors, when mentioned in passing, hinted at visits or activity I hadn't been informed of. I didn't press, I only observed, filing each fragment of information in a mental ledger. Suspicion solidified like concrete setting in my mind. The anomalies were not accidental, the contradictions not the result of carelessness. Something in this house, in the patterns of her behavior, was hidden from me intentionally. I felt the familiar rooms shift under the weight of that realization, their walls now holding secrets I had never accounted for. I began sketching mental maps of potential risks, rooms she might target, documents she could manipulate, small pockets of authority she could exploit. Every detail, from locks to timing of errands, was logged for later reference. By evening, a small but tangible clue emerged, a receipt for a locksmith visit scheduled for a day I had been absent, the signature clearly not mine. It confirmed what my instincts had been insisting: there was more at work here than casual familiarity. She had plans, and I was now able to see the faint outline of their intent. I found the envelope tucked beneath the corner of the dresser, its edges worn and the handwriting unfamiliar, precise, deliberate. Inside were papers that carried my name, my signature forged with care, authorizing access to the very room she had declared hers. My hand shook briefly as I held them, the weight of evidence far heavier than any suspicion. When I asked her about it casually, her smile didn't falter. She offered a quick excuse, a trivial misdirection about paperwork and deliveries, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of calculation. The keys I had always kept hidden in the top drawer of the desk were missing, replaced with a set that fit the lock perfectly. Each metal click against the door now sounded like a countdown. I ran through past interactions in my head, the small changes, the subtle shifts in how she arranged items, how she managed schedules, all the minor inconsistencies that had seemed insignificant. They now connected into a clear pattern. She had been testing the boundaries, marking her territory quietly, step by step. The betrayal hit harder than fear. It was the realization that someone I had allowed into my life and home could manipulate trust so deliberately, so seamlessly. I felt the hollow ache of that discovery press against my chest, but it didn't paralyze me. Instead, my mind sharpened, cataloging every action she had taken that now made sense in a new, alarming context. I noticed how she avoided eye contact when I asked about the envelope, a micro-expression too quick to be a mistake. Her casual tone was now a mask, thin and brittle, and I understood that her intentions extended beyond convenience or habit. This was calculated, methodical, and aimed at a permanent claim to my space. Every detail I had dismissed before, the slightly misplaced papers, the unexplained errands, the minor financial oddities now revealed themselves as preparatory moves. She'd been maneuvering for weeks, if not months, under the guise of normal household behavior. The room once familiar now felt like contested territory, a battleground of subtle power and intent. I realized the urgency of the situation. Waiting, ignoring, or underestimating her would only allow the manipulation to solidify. The house I had trusted, the walls I had relied on for a sense of control, were no longer secure. For the first time, I understood fully that I could not treat this as a minor household dispute. The danger was real, deliberate, and immediate. I called my lawyer first, speaking in careful tones that betrayed none of the alarm rising in my chest. When I explained the documents, the missing keys, the discrepancies in her explanations, the response was measured but firm. These were deliberate forgeries, and they carried real legal weight if left unchallenged. I noted every word, every pause, filing them internally as confirmation that my suspicions were no longer hypothetical. Next, I brought in the locksmith. He examined the lock, tracing the metal scratches and the way the cylinder had been replaced recently. Someone had access, and they knew exactly what they were doing, he said plainly, his hands precise and unhurried as he worked. I watched every movement, noting the small signs of tampering I had overlooked, the faint wear on the latch, the minor misalignment of the strike plate, the subtle tension in the doorframe. Each detail confirmed a carefully executed intrusion. I checked hidden storage myself, cupboards and drawers I had never thought to question. Some had been subtly rearranged, others reinforced or temporarily blocked in ways that suggested premeditation. My own home, the place I had built order into over decades, now felt compromised. Every object, every lock, every overlooked corner seemed a potential vulnerability. The stakes were immediate. Beyond the papers and the locks, the implications were clear. She could claim authority over this room, disrupt my routines, even challenge my autonomy within my own home. The thought tightened around my chest, cold and precise, forcing clarity. There was no longer room for denial or hesitation. I realized I had passed a point of no return. The evidence, the manipulation, the calculated avoidance of certain areas, it all pointed to a clear trajectory. If I did nothing, the balance of control would shift irreversibly. Waiting or hoping she would reveal her intentions voluntarily was no longer an option. I began forming a strategy in my mind, step by step, cataloging what I knew and what needed to be secured. Legal action, physical security, direct confrontation. Each element had to be timed, precise, and controlled. There was no margin for error. By the time I hung up the phone and locked the doors behind me, the decision was unavoidable. I would confront her directly. Not with anger or drama, but with measured evidence, clear authority, and the readiness to assert control over what had always been mine. The house, my space, demanded it, and I understood that hesitation would only make her advantage permanent. I spent the morning going over every detail in my head, rehearsing questions and how I would present the evidence without giving her room to deflect. Each forged document, each misplaced key, each subtle shift in her behavior was cataloged and paired with a precise question. I repeated the phrasing mentally, imagining her responses, anticipating the pauses and the excuses she might offer. My mind moved like a chessboard, plotting several moves ahead. As I observed her later, small slip-ups began to emerge. She answered a question too quickly, hesitated over an innocuous statement, and adjusted the placement of an item just slightly when she thought I wasn't looking. These micro-reactions, subtle and fleeting, revealed cracks in her composed exterior. I noted them without comment, mentally reinforcing the evidence I already held. I arranged practical measures, checking locks, securing documents, and ensuring that any critical items could not be accessed without my knowledge. I made phone calls to confirm appointments with the lawyer and the locksmith, letting a few trusted neighbors know to observe without raising suspicion. Each step reinforced a structure of control, preparing the environment for the confrontation to come. The tension in my chest grew heavier, not from fear but from awareness of the stakes. I thought about how I had trusted her at the start, how her initial warmth and attentiveness had disarmed caution, and how small acts of control had slowly accumulated beneath the surface. The sense of betrayal was measured, internalized, but sharp. It kept my attention focused and precise. Outside, minor incidents hinted that she might anticipate a confrontation. A misplaced note, a faint change in the way the hallway rug was aligned, subtle pauses in her steps when she thought I wasn't observing. Each one reinforced the need for caution and strategy, a reminder that any misstep on my part could give her the advantage. By mid-afternoon I had rehearsed, prepared, and positioned everything with deliberate care. The room that had once felt familiar now held the tension of an impending test. I knew exactly what I needed to ask, the evidence I needed to present, and the sequence I would follow. My thoughts were steady, my intentions clear. When I finally set down the papers and glanced toward the hallway where she moved, I felt ready. Not angry, not impulsive, but resolute. Every observation, every precaution, every note taken in quiet vigilance had led to this moment. I understood the balance of power, and I was prepared to assert it decisively. I called her into the hallway, keeping my voice even, controlled, careful not to give away the undercurrent of anger I felt. "I need to talk about the documents and the keys," I said plainly, placing the envelope on the table where she could see it. She paused, a flicker of hesitation crossing her face, but she tried to smile it off, brushing her hands together as if dusting an imaginary speck. I stepped closer, deliberately measured, watching her posture. "These were forged," I said, pointing to the papers, "and the keys weren't yours to replace." Her eyes narrowed, and she shifted, a subtle shuffle against the polished floorboards, testing the space as if she might retreat. I held my ground, calm, letting the physical tension mount without aggression, letting her realize the immobility of the situation. I laid out the evidence methodically, the forged signatures, the receipts she had tried to conceal, the carefully displaced items that had tracked her preparation. She reached for a weak excuse, a laugh that sounded forced, claiming misunderstanding, misplacement, coincidence. I listened without interrupting, letting each explanation falter under its own inconsistency. Her shoulders tensed, and I could see the calculated composure beginning to crack. Her voice rose slightly, irritation blending with an attempt at manipulation. She gestured to the room, insisting she had every right, that I was imagining control, that I misunderstood. I stayed quiet, presenting the keys and pointing to the replaced lock, letting the physical evidence speak where words failed. Each detail exposed her intent more clearly than any accusation could. The confrontation felt taut, the air thick with suppressed movement and awareness. She shifted again, glancing toward the door she thought she could claim, but I stood firm, unflinching, letting her realize that authority had returned to its rightful place. My voice remained calm, deliberate, punctuating the silence between her protests, grounding the situation in fact rather than argument. After several tense minutes, the resistance faded, her denials hollow against the undeniable truth I had assembled before her. I did not need to raise my voice, did not need to threaten. The exposure of her actions and the concrete evidence left no room for dispute. By the time she turned away, muttering excuses that now sounded empty, I understood the confrontation was over. The room was no longer a battleground. Control had returned where it belonged, and the intentions she had tried to mask were fully revealed. My home, my space, remained secure, the immediate danger resolved without a single raised hand or dramatic escalation. The lawyer arrived mid-morning, carrying a folder of documents and a calm authority that immediately shifted the atmosphere. I explained the situation again step by step, and he moved with quiet precision, contacting the appropriate authorities and filing notices to correct the forged signatures and the unauthorized key replacement. Within hours, official letters were served, locks were inspected, and the legal record confirmed that no claim she attempted would hold. Family members trickled in, drawn by the subtle tension that had built in the house over the past days. My son stared at the evidence with a mixture of disbelief and discomfort, while others avoided eye contact, silent in their processing of what had occurred. There were questions, brief and clipped, but no overt confrontation, just an acknowledgement that the facts left no room for dispute. I walked through the house afterward, noting the restored order. Drawers were returned to their proper configuration, locks verified, and the room I had feared losing once again felt settled, unassailable. Yet even in that physical restoration, the emotional residue remained. Relief mingled with a quiet bitterness at the manipulation I had endured, a reminder that trust could be weaponized even by someone so close. The authorities were methodical and unobtrusive, a contrast to the subtle chaos that had unfolded before them. I observed their work carefully, noting how procedural steps were capable of imposing clarity where deceit had thrived. Every signature verified, every key accounted for, reinforced the reality that vigilance and documentation were now as essential as any measure of goodwill in my household. I reflected on the minor inconsistencies I had dismissed before, the receipts, the altered items, the casual lies, and realized they had been early warnings I had failed to fully heed. The lesson was clear: trust must be measured, and authority over one's own space cannot be assumed. I cataloged these insights internally, knowing they would guide my actions in the weeks and months ahead. By evening, the house felt quieter, not in the oppressive way it had after the initial declaration, but in the calm sense of control regained. Each object, each room, each lock now carried the weight of assurance, the knowledge that intentional deceit could be countered with careful attention. The immediate threat was neutralized, the legal framework confirmed, and the household returned to its proper hierarchy. I allowed myself a measured breath, not relief as celebration, but as acknowledgement of order restored. The danger had passed, the challenge met, and the home once again reflected the authority and vigilance I had always intended it to embody. There was satisfaction in clarity, somber and controlled, grounded in reality rather than triumph. The mornings returned to a steady rhythm, deliberate and precise. I brewed coffee at the same hour, arranged the papers on the desk exactly as I preferred, and walked through the rooms with careful attention, noting each lock, each drawer, each corner. Boundaries were no longer abstract, they were reinforced physically and mentally, part of a routine that reminded me I was in control. The house felt familiar again, yet I carried the awareness that control was never guaranteed. It required constant diligence. I reflected on the lessons the ordeal had taught me. Trust could not be granted blindly, documents and signatures needed verification, and independence had to be maintained with deliberate care. I understood now that caution was not paranoia but a necessary element of preserving autonomy, that small misjudgments could ripple into serious consequences if left unchecked. Each decision, each verification became a quiet affirmation of my authority and responsibility. Gratitude surfaced for the professionals who had intervened. The lawyer, the locksmith, even neighbors who had observed quietly. Their expertise had turned suspicion into certainty, restoring the balance that had been threatened. I acknowledged their role without sentimentality, recognizing that expertise, procedure, and diligence had been essential shields against manipulation. The emotional residue of betrayal lingered, subtle but persistent. I allowed myself to feel it without letting it dominate my actions, noting that the pain of realizing someone close had acted with intent to deceive was distinct from the loss of control itself. Autonomy had been preserved, and that preservation carried weight far greater than resentment or anger. I maintained a quiet vigilance over personal space and legal matters. Doors were checked, records organized, keys accounted for. Yet the balance had shifted from reaction to routine. Awareness was integrated into daily life rather than looming as a constant threat. The home, once vulnerable to subtle intrusion, now stood as a controlled environment shaped by both caution and habit. In quiet moments, I considered the broader implications, how small unnoticed actions can accumulate, how ordinary interactions can conceal intent, and how authority over one's space is as much mental as physical. Awareness had replaced fear, measured observation replaced suspicion, and control had returned without drama. The moral was clear and grounded: protect your home, your rights, and your personal space. Do not assume trust is unbreakable, and do not mistake comfort for security. Vigilance, routine, and clarity are the shields that preserve autonomy. I moved forward with that knowledge, calm and deliberate, confident that the lessons learned would guard against deception long after the incident had passed.